Good morning, and thank you for giving me the chance to talk to you today virtually. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but I'm very glad that you've given me an opportunity to talk about something that is very close to my heart, and that's the ethics of digital storytelling. You can see me here for those who don't know me, and I'm working in a digital storytelling workshop at the Women's Zone here in Cape Town. And yeah, I've been doing digital storytelling for about 10 years now. I've done my PhD on it, and I love it. I'm passionate about digital storytelling. I think everybody who knows me knows that. But over the years, the more I engage with digital storytelling, especially with the more personal digital storytelling, the more I also encounter boundaries or push against ethical dilemmas that started to worry me quite strongly. So over the last few years, with many of my colleagues, we've started thinking about how to do this ethically. So what I'm going to talk about today is our journey, our thinking, how our thinking has changed when it comes to digital storytelling and the ethics of these personal narratives in the context of higher education. And I'm really glad that Pam Sykes is here. She's been one of our co-partners in this journey to engage with questions around ethics and digital storytelling. So I'm going to talk for about maybe 30 minutes, introduce our project, our ideas, but then Pam will be there in person to take any questions that you have and respond to them. I've added my email here, gashagoti@cput.ac.za, so if you have any questions, please just contact me. Get into a conversation. This is really the start. What we're doing right now is share our ideas as widely as we can to get a conversation going. So I also want to say that I'm not here by myself, but I'm here as one representative of a large community of digital storytelling practitioners, a community of inquiry, of people who started to think about the ethics of digital storytelling in higher education. My colleagues at CPUT, our students, who have shaped my thinking around the ethics quite strongly. Also local and international digital storytelling practitioners who have engaged with us, given feedback on our guidelines, helped us unpack issues, the ethical dilemmas that we encountered. And then in particular, I think what started our process of thinking, and in particular what helped us understand how digital storytelling can mean so many different things in different contexts, is the Untold conference in the UK. I think that was 2017. I was part of the ethics theme or stream, and we spent nearly 2 days just talking about ethics, and that was very helpful. But this presentation is based on a chapter that I've written with a colleague in the US, Christy Stewart, who has been using digital storytelling for many years in her teaching, in a book that's edited by Vivian Bosselek, Michalina Zemilas, and John Tronto, and that looks at posthuman and political care ethics for reconfiguring higher education pedagogies. And in this chapter, we kind of trace how our thinking has shifted or changed when it comes to ethics and digital storytelling. So a lot of the quotes on my thinking in this presentation comes from the chapter, or is condensed in the chapter. So what's nice in this context is that you all know what digital storytelling is. I assume that many of you have been part of a digital storytelling project in higher education. So you know how popular it is, and you know how much value it can add to a higher education classroom in terms of developing multimodal literacies, personal reflection, growth. But it has also more and more been used in participatory research methodologies, starting in public health education, but also more and more in professional development, teacher education. That's where a lot of our research started. And then more and more it's also being used in community engagement, students going out, collecting stories for the community, producing stories around specific themes. And the more we use digital storytelling at CPUT, we've been using digital stories for more than 10 years. We started in 2010 in the Faculty of Education. One of our colleagues heard about digital storytelling, came to a workshop we offered, and was hooked and said she wants to try it with her first year teacher education students to reflect on teacher identity and the kind of teacher they have become and critical moments that influenced them. And it worked so well, it was such a success that it has really spread across the institution, various disciplines and contexts in different ways. Often it's individual, sometimes it's in groups, sometimes it's more structured, sometimes it's really very much an independent piece of work, more or less supported, more or less personal. A lot of these stories are quite content-based, not all are as personal. I say that one in education. Lecturers get some training from us. I work in the central service unit that offers training to staff development, to lecturers. So some lecturers have gone through workshops with us, but not everyone. But more and more, we kind of uncover these ethical dilemmas that happen in classrooms where students start sharing stories. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about the different dilemmas that we have encountered. So myself, I use digital storytelling mostly to unpack students' identity and positionality. I find it works really well as such in the context of socially just pedagogies, to start difficult conversations in the classroom, especially if these storytelling projects are integrated in a critical theory curriculum. So if students are encouraged to read critical texts around race, gender, class, and then speak to the literature through their own lived experience. For me, that is really where the power of digital storytelling lies, when you combine the curriculum content with the personal story. And I mean, we often show Chimamanda Adichie's Danger of the Single Story to our students, to just start a conversation about how important it is to hear many stories, different stories, to hear not just your own story but also other people's stories, and the kind of dominant narratives that emerge when one listens to all these stories. So that's really where the magic, for me, of digital storytelling in higher education is. It's that integration of personal experience and curriculum content. And yeah, some lecturers manage to do that really, really well. This is an example of a digital story in journalism. The story I want to show you is at that time, Kazim Lanou was a first-year student in journalism, and the lecturer took them through a semester of engaging with critical texts. And then the students could pick one element, race, class, gender, language, culture, and develop a story around it. So I want to play this.
What am I? I ask myself, do I deserve to be treated this way? Why can't I walk down the street without hearing men catcall, whistle, strip me with their eyes, follow me, grab me? I must cover myself, look like them so I don't draw any attention. I'm told to be careful, be observant. You are a lady, and the world is not a safe place for you. What am I? I am a woman. I am not an object. I don't deserve to be treated this way. I want to walk down the street without being afraid of who could grab me and do things that I have nightmares about, or see headlines about young girl raped. So listen, we are the bodies that feed you in the womb. We are the bodies that birth you and protect you. So don't invade me. Don't treat me like a sexual object. Do not objectify my body. And don't touch me like that. I deserve respect. I deserve for you to not want to harm me, because I am a person too. I am a woman. I am your mother, your grandmother, your auntie, and your sister. I am a woman.
I find this story really powerful. Apologies. So yeah, I find this story really, really powerful, and I love it. I can watch it over and over again. I don't tire of this story because I think she has really managed to encapsulate such important messages around what it means to be a woman and her story in such powerful images. That I think it's one of the it's one of those stories that stay with me even after seeing it for so many times. But she also told her story into a classroom that was highly well prepared for these kind of stories. So she told her story to a classroom that had read critical theories, critical readings for many weeks. So the response to her story was a response that supported her. But that's not always the case. I know other situation, and in the chapter we are writing, my colleague is sharing a story where one of her black American students, African American students, is telling her story to a white classroom, and the response was just silence, discomfort, silence. Nobody knew how to respond, and she also just moved on in that moment, didn't know how to respond. So that was a space that was violent against that student. So these are situations that happen, and when one asks students to share their stories, one has to be extremely aware what kind of responses these stories can trigger within the student, but also in the audience, in her peers. So we have encountered so many of these issues where stories have been shared and things have happened and we haven't always responded appropriately, that we started thinking about how would one respond ethically, what would need to be in place for a space to be as safe as possible. We know that classrooms can never be safe places. We live in an unsafe world, so we live in a deeply divided world with a lot of with a lot of inequalities. So our classrooms will never be safe, but what can we do to make them as safe as possible? And when one looks at ethical approaches, one can there are basically two main approaches: normative ethical approaches and more contextual, situative, relational. And normative ethics basically says that there's a good and a right way of behaving, and it's about behaving right rather than wrong, or creating spaces where one would do the right thing. But it's very clear that there is a right thing, and that right thing doesn't change. It's the same right thing in all contexts and all situations. So that is often what ethical review boards are looking for, the right answers, like the tick box exercise, before one goes into a project, to make sure one ticks the right boxes. And we used to do that. I mean, my PhD, I did my IRB, I got my ethical clearance, and I thought I was fine. That's how my engagement with ethics started. I thought that's all that I needed, as long as I got ethical clearance. But often, Poza and Ross talk about that. Often this preoccupation with filling the form correctly, ticking the right boxes, actually distracts us from attending to really the challenging ethical issues, the stuff that happens after IRB approves your project. And these ethical issues are often really unruly and ambiguous, complex, resistant to simple need and formal assurances. So the IRB or normative ethical approaches for us just didn't work anymore. So then in our attempts to look at other spaces where we could learn or where we could get input in terms of ethics, we found the Story Center's principle of ethical practice that they wrote with Amy Hill, And they're useful. It's a code of conduct with clear guidelines, and it's a useful starting point. They are very much focused on the storyteller's well-being, to make sure the participants in a workshop are well supported, well cared for. They talk about expanding consent. It's a continuous process, and not just at the beginning of a process, but also, it's consent to come into a workshop, it's the consent to share your story, it's the consent to screen a story within a workshop, it's the consent to screen a story outside the workshop. But they're also very much concerned with knowledge production. Who owns the story? Whose knowledge is being emphasized? Who owns, who controls the storytelling? And it's very clear that the ownership always remains with the storyteller, so they can withdraw from a workshop process at any time. They can withdraw the story at any time, and it always has to have local relevance. And they're also very concerned with the distribution of stories, to make sure that you get consent. Like the story I've just showed you from the student, I got consent from her, and I'll ask her every time I share the story, I ask her if she's still okay with me sharing the story, and if I can, I'll invite her. If I present on digital stories and I want to show her story, I'll make sure I ask her if she can be part of that. So this is Amy Hill, and she has written about a lot around digital storytelling and the ethics, and it's very interesting as a starting point. These are other authors that have written in public health. Aline Gubrium, she works a lot with Amy Hill. There are some South African colleagues who have thought about the ethics of participatory visual methods. But there are certain assumptions in this workshop process that don't necessarily apply to higher education. They always talk about a small group of participants. In a workshop context, it's a bounded space, 2-3 days. The facilitators are highly skilled. They've often gone through the digital storytelling training, the Story Center, train-the-trainer offerings. It's voluntary. Participants can leave at any time. They can have the right to withdraw. They get a lot of support, both emotional, but also, in terms of digital literacy, access to technology. Often these workshop spaces are in certain are held in sites that have laptops, MacBooks, iPads. The storyteller chooses their story, so there's a claim for authenticity of the story. It's their story. They have a right to choose what story to tell, in what language. And often it's framed by this idea that storytelling is therapeutic, it's healing, it's cathartic. And it's a demarcated time. The relationship is bounded by the workshop space, both in space and time. And so it means you have this intense relationship, but then you go away and you might never see us, and you kind of might not see each other again. And when one applies that to higher education, it's a very different context, because the consent and the choice to withdraw is, for example, quite questionable, because it's an assignment, it's in the context of a classroom. Students, how voluntary is the participation? How much choice do they have if they have an assignment brief they have to respond to? We've had situations where students didn't want to take part in the digital storytelling project. They felt it was too personal, they didn't want to share. So there's always this question, can you offer an alternative assignment for those who don't want to be part of the digital storytelling process? Also in terms of support, some of our colleagues have gone through a workshop with us, but not everyone. So does every facilitator have all the kind of skills necessary? Because it's a lot. It's facilitating space, it's writing a script, it's knowing how to take pictures, it's about putting it all together, it's the music. So there's so many skills involved, and literacy is involved in developing a digital story. Does one lecturer have all of these skills? And then it's assessed. All these projects are often assessed, even if it's just milestones and, completed in some way or the other. If students do this project as part of their curriculum, they need to get something out of it. So what is assessed? How is it assessed? Who assesses it? What do you assess? The story, the process, the product, a reflective piece on the process. That's many ways of thinking about assessment, but it is a very contentious issue. A big thing if one does these kind of projects is that you want to share these stories with everybody else. This idea of sharing and sharing stories and hearing the other story What if somebody doesn't want to share their story? I mean, in some ways, what if a whole class decides not to share their stories? I know these are extreme examples, but this is where ethical boundaries are pushed. We've had situations where nearly a third of the students said they don't want to share their stories. So what does that mean? And what does it mean if, for example, it's a certain group of students who don't want to share? What is then what is the impact on other students who then share? Do they make themselves more vulnerable than others? So there are so many questions around it that we had to engage with. There's always that power dynamic between teacher and student researcher. The teacher at the end of the day has to assess these stories. So there's a power dynamic that you set up that you have to think about. There's always this idea of process versus product. The process is important, the reflective part, the learning to develop these digital stories, but at the end they're all screened and the differences are very visible. And again, is that fair to all students to, when their stories are screened and the sound doesn't work, or the pictures are grainy, or so the different digital literacies and access to technologies have huge impact on the quality of the output. So how can one support students to both engage in the process and learn from the process, but also have an aesthetically pleasing and engaging product? And there's also something around the responsibility towards stories and storytelling. When does it end? With a bounded workshop, your responsibility ends when the workshop is done. If you're a lecturer, you have an ongoing relationship to your students. What if something comes up in these stories that you have to deal with? And you have to continue. You have that responsibility, and it stays with you. So it's much more fuzzy than maybe in these workshops. So what became very clear when we started to engage with this, that context is everything, and that depending on which context you're in, the kind of questions you're asking, the answers you would get on those questions would be different. The ethical responses would be different. That's when we decided to actually develop our own guidelines for higher education, because we thought that really the more generic guidelines just don't work for us. So we have this document, and I hope Pam can show you after this presentation how to access it and where to find it. It's a living document, and it's divided into 3 areas. It's about digital storytelling in teaching and learning, in research, and community engagement. And it's work in progress. So please have a look, give us feedback. We'd love to hear whether you found them useful or not, these guidelines. What we realized that the more we engage with it, the bigger this document is becoming. So it's quite unwieldy. We're also quite responsive, because we feel like we're responding to situations, to ethical dilemmas. So it's reactive. And the more we engage with this, we also become these ethical killjoys, because we can see all the problems. So we often have these highly enthusiastic colleagues who just want to go ahead and do it, and I often feel like I'm stopping them in their tracks, and they get quite upset. And sometimes there are ethical dilemmas that, even with all the thinking and the feedback and the engagement, just don't resolve themselves as clearly and fully that we would like, even in hindsight. So in some ways, although we are working on these guidelines, one of the things that we have also started to think with is John's Toronto Ethics of Care. And that for me was a real revelation, because what I love about her is that, okay, she's centering care as a political project. So care becomes really a political tool, and it's not something that one has to be born with. It's not like women are better at caring at men, but it's not a disposition, it's a practice. So for me, that was so helpful, this idea that I'm practicing ethics. So if I mess it up once, it's not a train smash. I'm practicing an ethic of care. I'm practicing at getting better at caring. And it's in our everyday practices that I'm actually having to think about ethics the most. It's not in the big ethical questions, actually in our everyday practice that the ethical behavior comes out most, and we need to consider and practice it the most. So this is how she defines ethics then. It's a specious activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, so that we can live in it as well as possible. So again, this thing of we can never be ideal, we can never be perfect, we just have to try to live as well as possible in this world. And the world includes our bodies, ourselves, our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. So, contrary to the normative ethics, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no one size fits all. It's complex, and it's relational, and it's situational. So, depending on the context and the situation, the ethics of care will play out differently. And what's really helpful as well is that's not just me and the student, it's a complex web of people, of everyone that's involved in this caring relationship. So it's the HOD, it's the IT support person, it's the student, it's me, it's my colleagues, it's parents, it's everybody that's involved, the community that could be affected by these digital storytelling projects. And I know it sounds impossible to get everybody into the space, but just the thinking of who else would I need to talk to, who else would need to be involved, and it's not me as the facilitator having all the responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility. It's a reciprocity. It's a caring for each other, and I'm also not always in power. There's the intersectionality of care. So sometimes I'm the caregiver, sometimes I'm the one who needs to get the care. So it's so much more fluid. I found it very liberating. So that helped us move away from codes of conduct and guidelines, although they're important, to just saying, look, every situation is different. We have to look at the situation. We have to just think about who we are in that situation, how we care for ourselves and our students best in that situation. But then, and that is, I guess, when it takes me to the more posthuman ethics part, is, I mean, for everyone who has done this digital storytelling, you know that there are every year, in every project, there are these stories that stay with you. Mm-hmm. And they become separate entities with agency, separate from their storytellers. So there's something about the stories themselves that need to be cared for as well, or need to be considered as something that has power and agency and is acting and can affect and be affected. And this is where posthuman ethics is so interesting, because they kind of decenter the human and say, well, it's not just the human we have to care for, it's everything else, the non-human as well. And it's about not so much of the identities, the individual subjects that are part, but it's more about the practice, the knowledge-making practices, and what's happening, what is being constituted, what is being brought into existence in these knowledge-making practices. How are we becoming together in these knowledge-making practices? And the ethics then becomes an integral part. It's not something that we do at the beginning and we get ticked off. It's something that is entangled with who we are and how we make knowledge, how we create knowledge. Barat talks about ethico-onto-epistemological ethics. So it's that entanglement. It's an integral part of the world-making powers of inquiry. And it's so the kind of questions that then one would ask when you look at ethics in a posthuman way is what emerges when everything comes together, when the storyteller, the story, the audience, the silence, the space, the context, the technology come together in a room. What emerges in that encounter? What is brought to the fore? What is created, constituted, performed? So the silence, the story I was telling at the beginning about this student who told her story, and there was this silence by everyone as a response. That is not something then to be avoided, but it's something that brings something to the fore. Something was brought to the fore in that silence that was already there in the room, but maybe not seen as strongly. So it's about what to do with that silence. What is performed in that silence, and how can we engage that silence? Who are we becoming in that assemblage? And there's no innocence. Practices are violent because we live in a violent world. So our classrooms are just microcosms of the larger environment. So whatever happens out there, whatever inequality, injustice, we recreate in our environment. So we also need to be crystal clear that we are not creating innocent spaces. These spaces will cause violence, but it's about recognizing that and working with that. So I think this is where I want to stop. And I've spoken a lot, and I hope I've opened spaces to engage and to have conversations. I love this quote by Pradotti in her most recent book, Posthuman Knowledge. We are in this together, but we're not the same. I think that is so important. And that links to the violent spaces. And what happens in a digital storytelling space, and how can we work with this ethically? So I'm going to stop now. We have added lots of resources. I will share the presentation. But thank you for listening. And my colleague, I'm handing over to my colleague Pam, who will hopefully be able to answer all your questions. Thank you so much.